So yeah, today we're going to talk about CSS Grid, but I also can't pass up the opportunity when I'm on the stage to have a little bit of a rant about a thing that bothers me. So Peter apologized for sounding a bit ranty. I'm not sorry. Oh, go clicker. Oh. Yep, okay. Sorry, clicker. All right, as Rick mentioned, did you mention? I'm a senior developer at Shine Solutions. I'm a Mozilla Tech Speaker and a Google Developer Expert in the area of web. And as part of my work at Shine, I consult at a large Australian energy retailer. For some reason, they don't like it when I name them in my talks. So I call them the Unnamed Electricity Company, and I drew them a nice logo. I'm sure they would appreciate if they knew it existed. Oh shit, there's someone here from there today. Yeah, and at the Unnamed Electricity Company, we have a pretty normal process where we build features, and our design process, I think, is a fairly typical way of doing things across different organizations. So when we're ready to build a feature, our designers build us a mockup. They actually build us high-fidelity mockups, but it turns out that my artistic ability doesn't extend beyond that picture of Australia with a lightning bolt and squares. So they'll give us a mockup for like a screen that's 1400 pixels wide, and depending on the design, we might get one for a tablet and for a phone. And, you know, it's all well and good, but as a developer, these aren't actually super useful to me. See, the thing is, in the real world, all of the screen sizes in between that also exist. And like, if we look, oh, I pressed that button again. All right, I pressed the keyboard. So we look at the desktop layout, you see we've got 4 columns of these square things. Whereas on the tablet, there's only 2. What happened in between? Like, did the spaces get in there first, or did we add the extra columns? I don't know. And on the mobile, like now there's only 1 column, but the nav is up the top. Like, how did we get there? So if these designs are like so unhelpful, why do we use them? And I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is, and this is going to be a little bit contentious, but the tools that we use for designing for the web aren't very good for designing for the web. And the reason I say that is when you're looking at something like Sketch or InVision, you go in and you say, I want a box that's this big, and I want it here. And I want another box that's this big, and I want it over here. And that's not how HTML works at all, right? When I write HTML, I just have a bunch of things. Bang, 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 bang. And like there's no space on a web page. It's all things. So for instance, if I have 3 HTML elements here, and I've made them the size I want in the position I want, if I add some content to this one, it gets bigger, and it makes that other one move. And I might add vertical content. For some reason, the one that I didn't touch moves down. Don't become a developer. So as I add content to them, like everything else on the page moves depending on what I'm doing. Like everything in an HTML page is interconnected. There is no independent pieces of anything. That's one thing. But you don't have to take my word for it. Because I'm focused in the things. You don't have to take my word for it. This guy who allegedly is actually a designer, I'm sure he's a really nice fellow, Tom Johnson, he wrote this article called Design Tools Are Holding Us Back. And I think you should read it because it agrees with everything I believe, but, but also it goes into a lot more detail about the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Right, so that's one thing. The other reason that we use these static layouts with these weird breakpoints is that the web's not very good at the web. So, traditionally, CSS has been pretty rubbish at layout. So up until we got flexbox, there just wasn't really any way to do layouts using CSS. So instead, developers relied on tools like Bootstrap, which provides a simple way of doing this kind of layout. Now, if you've not seen how Bootstrap works, and I know some of the designers in the room probably haven't, because I honestly spoke to one of the guys at work, and he literally thought that Bootstrap did responsive design by magic. I'm like, no, we code it. But anyway, if you want to lay something out in Bootstrap, it's got something called Bootstrap Grid, which is not related to CSS Grid at all. And it divides the page into 12 imaginary columns. And then whenever you want to add something on the page, you add a row, see that row up here, and then you add your content and you say how many columns it should take up. All right, so here, this first one is going to take up, on very small screens, like on a phone, it's going to take up 5 columns, and the second one will take up 7 columns. On a slightly larger screen, like maybe a phone in landscape mode or something, they'll take up 6 each. And then on a big screen like here, one will take up 4 and the other will take up 8. Right? So currently they're in the 4:8 configuration. If I make the screen smaller, you can see they switch to the 6:6. And if you get it really small, they'll go down to the 5:7. So this works pretty well. It is pretty nifty, don't get me wrong. But it has a major drawback. And that is that it relies on these standardized breakpoints. Now, Bootstrap has 5 of them, which is more than I normally get at work, but these breakpoints, like, they refer to imaginary devices. They're just kind of averages. And if we're building our designs using these breakpoints, it means that we're optimizing our designs for imaginary devices that no one's actually using. Which, I don't know about you, but that sounds a little bit like not the right way to go about things if we have an alternative. Like, as far as I'm concerned, we should be building our designs so that they reflow at the point that it makes sense in the design. So, my point of contention is, oh God, now I can't use my mouse. Device-based breakpoints are a bit rubbish. Oh, sorry, was that? They're a bit shit, in Young says. So they're not a good way to design things, and they're not a good way to build things. So, what should we do instead? Like, I can tell you from the development point of view, but I don't really know how we can make the design side better. In my ideal world, all of the designers would create their designs in HTML and CSS. But for some reason, the designers I talk to are really resistant to doing my job for me. Not really sure. I do think one thing that's super important, though, is that designers do have an understanding of how HTML and CSS works. Like, if you're a civil engineer designing a bridge, you would know everything about the concrete in your bridge, right? How it works. Even if you never go out and lay any of that concrete yourself, you still understand the medium that you're working in. And I think if designers can understand that part of HTML and CSS, we can do some really cool things. So these layouts are all from a talk called Superhero Layouts by Anton, whose last name I've forgotten, but he's from Western Australia, so there can't be that many of them. So he did this talk at Web Directions this year, and he's basically recreated a bunch of layouts from comic books just using web technologies. So this is all CSS Grid, CSS shapes, all that kind of stuff. And it's really cool. We're not going to do anything that cool today. What we're going to do instead is like a boring thing, but in a cool way. So we're going to have a look at CSS Grid. So that's the ranting part over. You can all learn about CSS Grid now. So yeah, CSS Grid is new-ish. It's been around for a while, but it's only sort of becoming widely adopted now, I think. So to understand Grid, there are 2 super important things that you need to understand first. Oh, why is this sleeping? So the first thing is that in normal CSS, the rules that you're applying apply to the element that you're applying them to, right? So you can change something's width, its height, its color, its whatever. But the CSS applies to that thing. Grid doesn't work like that. So we apply Grid to this top level container, and it goes, I'm a grid, and nothing changes. What it affects is all of the children. So grid, rather than affecting the element that it's applied to, it affects the relationships between all of its children. The second thing that you need to understand is that the grid exists independent of the elements in it. So this is completely different to how something like the Bootstrap grid works. It's completely different to how most things work in CSS. And as a developer, wrapping my brain around that was really hard. For designers, you're probably just like, duh. Okay, so here we have a grid. Can everybody see the grid lines? Good, because your only other alternative is to move closer. And we can see it's a 2x2 grid. And we know it's a 2x2 grid because we've got some CSS here that says it's a grid. It says it's a grid with columns, and it's got 2 columns, and they're 1 FR wide each. And it's got 2 rows, and they're 1 FR wide tall. Right? That's really straightforward, really simple. Except what the fuck is an FR? So an FR is a fraction of the available space. If we look at our 2 columns here, we've got 2 of them, and they're 1 FR each, so they both take up half of the available space. If we resize our viewport, you can see they still take up half of the space. We can change it from 1 FR. You can use other numbers. So we can say 4 FR. And now the first column takes up 4/5 of the space, and the second one takes up the remaining 1/5. And if we resize the viewport, they maintain that ratio. We can also mix it with other units. So we can say 200 pixels. Now the first column will be 200 pixels wide, and the second column will take up as much space as we need. Right? So we've got something that needs to stretch out over space, make it an FR. Grid without anything in it is pretty boring. So let's add, oh no, let's just put one thing in it for now. Got to save things before they, that's the wrong grid. Oh no. Okay, save that one. Go to the right one, which already had the stuff commented out. Right. Pretend that never happened. Okay, so now I've got a grid with an element in it. And by default, it's going to appear in the top left corner. Maybe we don't want it in the top left corner. We can change it. So we can say we want to align self, say center, which will change its vertical alignment. And we can say we want to justify self, say end, and that'll change its horizontal alignment. So we can put it wherever we want in the square. I mean, I say wherever we want, we can put it at the start, the middle, or the end in 2 dimensions. All right, again, though, a grid with one thing in it is kind of boring. So let's add some more things. All right, now we've got 3 things. Again, we can move them. If we don't want them up in the top left like that, we don't have to move them one by one. We can just say align items, center, and justify items. And now if we resize the grid, we can see our items just stay in the center. They stay in the same place relative to each other. And this is great, and it's going to be absolutely what you want in some situations. But in other situations, you're probably going to want your items to resize according to the grid. So we can do that. Instead of saying we want each one to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, we say we want it 100%. And then it will fill up all of the space. And if we resize the grid again, they'll stretch to fill the space. We can also have grid items that cover more than one cell. If we grab this one, we can say, what do we want to say? Grid, column, span 2. And now it will span across 2 columns, and everything else will get pushed down. And the grid has some funky algorithms about how it works out, like where things should go when you do that. You have a little bit of control over, but it generally works things out pretty clever. All right, so this is great if you have a layout where you know how many items you have. So if you're building like a media object or a card or a form where you know how many elements are on it, and you know where you want everything to sit relative to each other, you can put it in a grid and it will look fantastic. Like guaranteed 100%, there's no way you can fuck it up. Sometimes though on the web, I don't know if you've noticed, but you don't know how many things you're going to deal with. Right? Sometimes there's a list and you don't know how many things are in it. So what happens in the grid then? Let's add more items than we have space for. The grid just kind of deals with it. In this case, we've said that we want the first two rows to take up as much space as possible. So the first two rows are taking up as much space as possible, and the third one is taking up as little space as possible. It looks a bit rubbish though. So what we can do instead is just say, look, grid, you work it out. I won't tell you what kind of rows to do. And it'll just work it out. Everything will be evenly spaced. And if we keep adding stuff, it'll just keep resizing everything, shuffling it up so it all fits in. So this is cool, but like white space is what makes a design, right? This is very crowded. What if we wanted some space between our elements? Grid does that too. If we go into our grid here, we can say we want a grid gap of say 40 pixels. And now we'll get 40 pixels space between each element, and we can resize the grid, and we'll get 40 pixels. Or we could say we want 5%. And now the gaps will resize according to the width of the grid. That's 5% of the whole grid, not 5% of an element, by the way. We can also like do different horizontally and vertically. So that's looking pretty cool, right? You're all pretty amazed. Look how amazed you all are. Yeah, it gets better. I know. This beer, however, does not get better. Yeah. So here we have a grid with 4 columns that are each as wide as they can be. So this is the same as the other one here. This is the same as if I'd written 1FR, 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 but developers really hate writing the same thing twice and will quite happily write something that's longer as long as it's different. So now we've got our 4 columns, and if we resize this, it works just like before. So oftentimes, yep, this is what we want, but sometimes what we want is we want columns that are 200 pixels wide, and we just want as many of them as are going to fit on the screen. Grid can do that too. Instead of saying repeat 4 times, we say repeat autofit. And then we say we want each one to be 200 pixels wide. So now each column is 200 pixels wide, and as soon as there's at least 200 pixels space here, it will switch to 5 columns. And it'll keep going. And they'll switch down. And yeah. So that's cool. But you'll notice as we increase the viewport, we get this bit of white space here, which doesn't look, I mean, it does look nice because it's sort of rainbow tinted, but it's probably not what we're after in a design. So what we really want is for the elements to grow until they get to the point where there's enough room to fit another column in. Grid can do that too. So if we use the min-max function, it basically says, I want my columns to be between this width and this width. So between 200 pixels and the remaining space. So now we've got our 4 columns, and they're a bit more than 200 pixels wide. As we increase the viewport, well, let's go the other way. So as we increase the viewport, the columns get wider until there's enough room for the third one. But we don't get that white space, right? Our grid is all still nicely centered. So at this point now, we've got enough to do some really cool stuff. Now, if you cast your mind back over the minutes, back to that original design that we had at the start with the 3 breakpoints, here it is here, realized in all its glory. So here's our mobile view. And where was it? There's our tablet view. And there's our desktop view. Right? Does anybody want to guess how many breakpoints I had to put in this? Anybody? It was 1. 1. There's 1 breakpoint. It's right here. See where the season 1 words? And then I need to make them disappear. That's it. So this thing is built, and it's got all of the, it's got all of the in-between states. Like when there's 2 columns and 3, where did we go? 2 columns, yeah, and 3 columns and stuff like that. And it just works. And it just makes sense at every width without needing a bunch of breakpoints, right? What I need is to know that these boxes need to be this wide to this wide. I need to know that this menu just moves down when there's space, essentially. I don't actually know how it works. No, I do know how it works. So this is a mixture of grid and flexbox. But yeah, you can do all of this without any breakpoints, unless you want words to disappear. All right, cool. So, what have we learnt today? First of all, language is important. The way that we're describing things really matters, like when we're trying to communicate between designers and developers. And if designers aren't speaking in the language that developers are developing in, then things get really awkward. HTML is about relationships. There's no blank space on an HTML page, right? Everything is either an element or a margin, and everything is connected to each other, and anytime you change one thing, something else is mysteriously going to move left, and then you're going to cry. And I mean, it's not like that. It's everything is connected, though. Thirdly, most importantly, grid is magic. Cool. So that's me. If you want to disagree with me on Twitter, because that's what it's for, you can get me there. The slides are available at this URL. The slides work best in Firefox, and the demo works best in Chrome. No, just that the 2 browsers implement different subsets of CSS, and I am going to use all of the CSS. The grid stuff works the same in both, though. And yeah, that's me. Thank you.